Hello crafters and welcome back to the ScrapbookPal YouTube channel. My name is Deepa from Designs by Dee and I have two cards to share with you today. Now today's cards are going to be made using Honeybee Stamps products, specifically the Scandinavian Christmas stamp set and coordinating dies, and I'll also be using a couple of the gem sets that they have. So let's go ahead and look at the products. As you can see, the stamp set is a nice huge one. You've got a bunch of different images of trees and branches. You've got a berry set, some stars, and you've got two frames. You get a circle and a hexagon, which you can use to put all of these images in and build around. You've got the coordinating dies. It cuts everything out here, and I love the fact that they're already disconnected, and there's also a die for the sentiment. And then we've got some jewels, which are the holiday and winter wonder jewels. So one of them, I think the holiday ones are pearls and the winter wonder are more faceted gems. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a simpler card. So this one is perfect for mass production. The way that I'm doing it is probably not how you would do the mass production, or maybe I'll just indicate exactly where you would start switching out your panels. So for the first step, all I did was take that panel, so this is an A2 size panel, and I heat embossed the sentiment in the upper center of the card. And I did that with some white embossing powder. And once that's all heated and set, I can move on to the stamping. And you can just basically do this with a ton of panels. It doesn't take too long to do. Stamp them all out, add your powder, heat them all up at once. And then the next step is to go to your stamp set and grab some of the Scandinavian Christmas images and arrange them on your panel closer to the bottom to create a kind of like a semicircle or a little bit of like a V that kind of leads up to your sentiment. So you're drawing the viewer in from the bottom of the card up to the sentiment. And don't fill it completely, just use a few. I use about 4 or 5 here, and then stamp it out in one color. So the first color I'm using here is old paper, and I'm choosing to use Oxide inks. Now the reason why is you can see I'm stamping on a darker cardstock, so I want my ink to show up. If I used a dye ink, it would just absorb into the paper. You wouldn't see anything. Oxide inks have a pigment component to them, therefore it will show up on top. So I'm starting off with the old paper, and then I'll put some more images and fill in that bottom part of the card panel and put those images on and stamp them out in a different color. Now this is where you would do your mass production. So I've done one color, switch out all your panels and stamp them all, and then do the next color, and so on and so forth. So for my second color, I'm using Tattered Rose. So this is a nice light pink, and in the end, it's going to end up looking more of a milky white, and that's okay because it's the look I was going for. I really do recommend taking the cardstock that you're going to use if it's darker, and the same idea of what I'm doing, and just take a little bit of that ink on the cardstock and let it dry completely so you can see what color it ends up looking like. If it's too light, you know to go a bit darker. If it's too dark, you know to go a bit lighter. And that's exactly what I did before I made this card to make sure all my colors were going to work together and show up nicely on the cardstock. Okay, so I'm only using 3 colors, so I'm really just setting up these images 3 times. And for the third time, I use some barn door ink, and this is a nice red. So you can see it's not a light color like the other two, but looks absolutely gorgeous. It stamps very red at first, but you'll notice when it dries, it becomes a bit more pinky. And now to fill in all the other areas in this in the bottom of this card, I decided to do some freehand stamping. So I'm just using my acrylic block and the same colors. You see, I've just laid them all out there. And I'm using the little, the rope, the dotted rope here. I'm kind of masking it off a bit. And as I stamp, you'll notice I'm always stamping at least twice. So just like when I stamped out all of the other images with my Misty, I didn't just stamp the color once. I actually stamped over it about 3 or 4 times to get the most true version of that color on this darker cardstock. And now all I'm really doing is I'm taking all of the smaller little stamps within the stamp set, and I'm just filling this in, right? So you could opt to do this. You could probably just place all of these on your Misty and then just stamp them all in a 4th color, which would make this much easier to do. And that way your mass production would be easier as well. And you can see I'm basically just filling in all the little spaces to make it more complete. Once that's done, I'll go ahead and create my card base. So this is just a top folding A2 size card base. And I'm just going to adhere it to the front. Now, I didn't make it so that there was a border. This is exactly A2 size, so this is taking up the full front of the card. Now I have a little bit of white peeking out on the right side, so I'll just go ahead and trim that off so that it's completely square. That sometimes happens when I'm cutting. Now for the pearls, so this is the holiday pearl sticker set. You can see I've kind of just stapled the actual pearl set to the cardstock backing in the packaging, just so everything stays together and I know what I'm using in the future. And all I'm doing is just using my pick for die cutting, and I'm just picking off the little pearls and placing them in throughout the imagery at the bottom of the card and just above the bow at the top. I love these gold color pearls because they have a nice muted tone to it. They're not like a bright gold, so they work perfectly with this card that has the muted greens and pinks, and that red, even though it was really bright to start with, you can see it looks less bright now and just works with the rest of the card. And, you know, I tried to keep this simple, but I couldn't do it. You can, if you're doing mass production, definitely don't need to do all of these extra little bits. But I'm using some diamond stickles just to add a little bit of shine to those little dotted elements throughout the card, because, I don't know, I felt like it was a little too muted, but that's just me and my style. You might like the muted form of it without all the shine a lot better, and that is a little bit more indicative of the Scandinavian theme and what the stamp set pretty much represents. So you can see I didn't use the frame here, but I will in my second card. So for the second card, we're moving on with another panel. This one is a blue panel, and I've cut it just a bit smaller than an A2 size card base. And this is going to allow me to have a little bit of a border when I place it onto my white card base. And to stamp out this background, we're basically going to be creating a frame around this panel with all of the branches and bushy elements. So I'm not using any of the trees, just mainly the branches. And I'm going to place them all around the top and the right edge of the panel. The reason why is because I can still line up my panel and butt it up against the corner of my MISTI, and I can have these other pieces hanging off the edge of the card to create that border. So in the end, all I'm really going to have to do is stamp and heat emboss this twice. And so I'll pick everything up with my MISTI once I've positioned it where I want it. I'm going to use my anti-static powder tool, which is very important. And then I'm just using some Versamark ink along with some more white embossing powder, just like we used on the first card. So as I mentioned, for this card, I'm going to be using the frame. So I think the circle frame for this one, you could use the hexagon one if you wanted to. And if you wanted to do this design for mass production, to maybe make it simpler, just maybe cut out a bunch of the frames, like stamp them and cut them out, and then just put the sentiment in the center and keep it simple. That way you could create a bunch of these and use them as Christmas cards too. Okay, so once I've heated this up, you can see that white on the blue looks absolutely stunning. And all I have to do now is flip my panel. Now I will have to adjust a couple pieces in the corner because they will probably overlap. And I'm going to say right now, if you don't mind the overlap, you could probably overlap it. It wouldn't be a big deal. It would look a little more natural because, I mean, in real life, branches don't space themselves out. They all overlap, right? So I think that if you wanted to keep those two extra bits on the corner, it'd be fine. But I did move mine so that you could see each image separately. Okay, so now that this is, we're stamping out the second half, I love using the darker cardstock here because I can really see that Versamark show up. So I know for sure I'm going to get a nice good impression, and my embossing should turn out well as long as I've used the anti-static powder tool. Okay, so I hit that with some heat, and now I'm just going to darken the edges. So I'm just using some chipped sapphire, this is not an Oxide ink, this is the Distress ink. So this is more of a dye ink, so it will absorb into the panel, which is all right. I know we're using a colored panel, but we're using the same color, just a little bit darker. And I find that darkening the edges really helps to draw your viewer into the center of the card, and I really just like how it looks on that white embossing. It really just makes that white embossing stand out a little bit more. Now, I've gone around all of the edges generously with the chip sapphire, and then I used a bit of black soot just to make it a little bit darker on the very edges. And then don't forget to buff it off with a dry towel to make sure that all of that ink comes off your white embossing. Okay, so my next step, which you see me do here, is to lay out some more of these images from the stamp set and stamp them out with I think actually I'm going to use 3 other colors. I'm using Victorian velvet for some of the branches and the bells, and then I'm also going to use some more of the branches for to create a variation in color. I'm going to be using some tattered rose here. So the pink and the blue I find goes very nice together and has a nice soft, and the pink stands out nicely on the blue, especially these lighter pinks or peaches. So I really like this color combo. So I'll go ahead and stamp all of these little pieces out. And you can see I also chose just 2 images, the bow and the candle, to stamp out in Stormy Sky. Now again, here I'm using just the Oxide inks. And then I did leave the little, like the flame of the candle blank, and I'm adding some scattered straw there just to make sure it has that yellow tone of a candle. So that's really the only place I used that. Now, I'm also stamping out the sentiment, and I'm using some VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. I love this ink because you only need to stamp it once. You can see I stamped that by hand, and I didn't have to be careful with anything. It just stamped perfectly. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut the frame. Now you could stamp out the circle and cut it out with the 2 circle dies that come with the coordinating die set. Or, like I'm doing, you could just use the circles to cut out the frame itself without the stamp. So I chose to do that and use some matte gold cardstock. You can see the bit of the bottom was cut off, but that's okay. It's going to get covered with branches, and I don't like throwing things away. Now, my last step before I assemble everything is to die cut all of these little pieces. So I'm just using the coordinating dies, lining them all up. I stick them down with some washi tape or some low tack tape, and I just put them all through my die cutting machine. Now you can see I also cut out the rope, the beaded rope that is going to hold the frame, just plainly with the cardstock. I didn't stamp anything, and that also looks good as well. So I think one of the things that I really do appreciate with Honeybee stamps is that they've already separated all their dies, and that just saves so much time, especially in a stamp set or a set in general like this with all of these little pieces. It would take forever to cut those out with my little clipper. So thank you for that. And then once I've cut out all of my little bits, I like to kind of organize them. I have this little section bowl here, and it just kind of organizes all my die cuts, allows me to see everything at once so that when I'm assembling, it's much easier. So there's all of my little bits. You can see that the colors work well together as well. Let's go ahead and put this together. So starting off with that circle frame, I'm using some foam strips, and these foam strips are perfect. They fit exactly in the width of that frame, so you can just kind of position them around the circle. I find that taking the backing off allows you to mold that foam a little bit better to get it to have the right curve. Then once all the foam is on there, I can go ahead and add that to the center of that branch background. So this frame, I wanted to add the foam there because I wanted it to stand up since it is the focal point. Now before I go ahead and put more of this together, I am going to attach it to the card base. Again, I've got an A2 size top folding white card base, and I'm just going to attach this so that I get a little bit of a white border around the edge. And now it's basically a matter of positioning all the little die cuts that we cut out. So I've added the little candle in there. That's added with another foam strip. I'm adding the beaded rope. I'm going to cut off the extra bit. That one I just glued flat onto the card. And that's okay because our frame is the feature of this card. Or I mean the focal point. And you can see I'm using a whole bunch of different foam squares. There's little tiny squares. There's ones that are a little bit bigger, medium sized. There's the large squares. All of them come in handy to do all of this work. And I find the foam really helps bring out, your focal point. It creates depth. It just brings your card to life. So I've gone ahead and added the sentiment at the bottom there. At first I was kind of contemplating adding it across the rope at the top or kind of in the frame, but I felt that with the candle there it wouldn't quite fit nicely. So as I was saying before, if you wanted to make this easier without adding all of this, you could just put the sentiment in the middle of that frame and that would be good to go. So now that I've basically built up that little circle frame with the candle and all the cute little pink branches, I'm adding the little blue bow at the top just to finish this off a little bit. And you can see with that branched background, it looks really nice. Very calm and serene looking. And then I have two final steps here just to jazz up your card a little bit. They are optional. I love the gems. So the Winter Wonder gems are what I'm using here. I'm using the probably the second or third darkest blue just to add a gem here and there on the die cut pieces, and then again in the background where all the branches are. I'm also adding some of the opaque white the gem stickers to the background as well. And you can see I added little dots of glue, and that's just me forgetting that I don't need to. They have a sticky back, so that's good to know. And then to finish this off and give it that beautiful look, I'm taking some diamond stickles and I'm just creating like a halo of light around the candle and on the flame, just to make it look like it's lit up and glowing. And those are my two cards for inspiration for the Scandinavian Christmas set by Honeybee Stamps. You've got one plainer, little more simpler card, which is in keeping with the Scandinavian theme, and then you've got one that's a little bit more jazzed up and uses that circle frame from the set. Now, I hope that you've been inspired to create something similar. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell for future videos. Everything that's been used here has been linked in the description below, and I hope to see you guys again next time. Bye.